Hello, I'm David Gordon-Koch, reporting from Moncton for the NB Media Co-op. I'm joined today by Chief Terry Richardson of Papineau First Nation to talk about some issues in the provincial election that's currently underway here in New Brunswick. Chief Richardson, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave, and taking the time.
Well, first up, let's talk about the issue of systemic racism in policing. This issue was thrust into the spotlight, of course, again with the tragic death of 34-year-old Stephen Dedam, better known as Iggy, of Elsipogtog First Nation. Iggy was fatally shot by a member of the RCMP on September 8th at his home. This, of course, comes less than 5 years after two previous fatal police shootings of Indigenous people in New Brunswick, namely Chantel Moore in Edmundston and Rodney Levi of Mi'kmaq Nation, who was shot by RCMP in the Boom Road area near Miramichi. So can you talk about the provincial government's record on this issue from your perspective, Chief Richardson?
Well, David, I would even go across Canada. There was many shootings. I think of 7 or 8 First Nation shootings across Canada. So, I think, it's a case by case, and doing it. How do we make it perfect? I mean, we are working on it within our First Nation communities to have our own peacekeeping, our own police. Some communities have asked for their own police force. But, you've got to work together, and negotiations at the table and talking and figuring it out. But if you're not at the table negotiating, then you're doing it on your own. And, you talked about the relationship with this particular provincial government. That's the problem we have. They won't come to the table and negotiate. And, it's a negotiate-told approach. I know I can talk for my community here in Papineau. I'm very fortunate that our relationship with the RCMP is excellent. I say that because we put a lot of effort into it. We have them come into our community. We have them engage in activities in the community. We have them come in and serve breakfast. We have a breakfast for people who can't afford, people who have addiction issues, people within the community that have problems. We serve them breakfast once a week on a Tuesday, and the RCMP actually come in and prepare that breakfast. So they get to meet everybody, and it becomes more of a personal. It's not Constable so-and-so. It's, oh, I remember you from the breakfast, and hey, John, how are you doing? And it develops that rapport. But we also have a security force in our communities that has recently started. We have a peacekeeper force in our community, and they have done a lot of great work in keeping order in our community as well. They're not police officers, but they're eyes and ears of the RCMP, and they help as well. So I think those are what we've got to expand on. And unfortunately, we're still arriving at this point where, how many years later, we're still having these deaths in our First Nation communities. We have people who are dying for no reason at all. I mean, that's, it was supposed to be a wellness check. There's an argument it wasn't a wellness check. The community is saying it was. I mean, we've got to address these issues, and we've got to do it together.
You mentioned across Canada, and in fact, yes, Iggy's death was among 6 that occurred across Canada in an 11-day period. And you mentioned also your peacekeeper force. Could you talk more about that? When was it established, and what was the kind of driving force behind that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dave. I guess from us, our peacekeepers came about during COVID, when we were trying to keep our community safe by keeping outsiders out of the community and ensuring that COVID wasn't spreading within the community. And we sort of evolved it into, we did it on our own within our community. We were able, because we had a provincial tax agreement with the province of New Brunswick, we were able to fund that and keep it going through own source revenue to actually provide that service. And we sort of just evolved it into a peacekeeping type of situation. Then our organization, MTI, which represents the 9 Mi'kmaq bands, had put a proposal through the federal government, and we got federal support. We have a little bit of provincial support, and now this has evolved into where we're actually having, these individuals in our community providing that security for our communities. Again, eyes and ears. They don't arrest people, but they're witnesses. So therefore, if something illegal occurs, you have witnesses. They work in groups of 2 for safety, obviously. And for us, it's been a huge success because we do it. Obviously, most of your crime occurs at night. So we've been using it, and we've been talking to our local municipalities and saying, maybe this is a model that you should be utilizing outside of First Nations, and having individuals, whether it be people who serve warrants or whatever, and have them as a eyes and ears for the local police forces as well. Because we all know that our police forces are understaffed, and, there's a need for more police officers for sure.
A moment ago, you referenced the tax sharing agreement. You said that was helpful in being able to put this thing on the ground. Is that not the tax agreement that was canceled by the provincial government?
Yes, it was. So now we're in a lot of these programs now within First Nation communities are being questioned because we don't have that anymore. Uh, it's sad. I talk about relationships, and in this time of reconciliation, where we're looking at Truth and Reconciliation Day, the 30th of September. Um, we've had none with this particular provincial government, unfortunately, and it's sad. It saddens me because we could do so much together, and we understand. Look, First Nations aren't asking for everything, but we're asking for participation. We're asking to come to the table and negotiate in a meaningful manner. And unfortunately, they're not willing to do that. I mean, the tax agreement was a perfect example. They just gave us a phone call, said the tax agreement is canceled and don't ask any questions, and hung up. I mean, they had all the chiefs on the line to do that. And so we said, okay, well, what's going to take that place? They came out with an agreement. They call it an economic development agreement, but actually it's houses. So it's not creating economic wealth in our communities. And they threw that out there. So of course, some communities who are in dire need of housing latched onto it. But in reality, it's not an economic development package. So we've said, I even sat with the premier, and said to him, Premier, I said, I have a solution for you. And I gave him a solution, and he just laughed at me. And I said, well, Premier, all we're asking for is the chance for our communities to become prosperous. And, I'll quote his actual response to me was, and I quote, why should First Nations be rich? And I said, Mr. Premier, I said, we're not talking about being rich. We're about the opportunity to take our own and develop our own and make our own. That's what we're looking for. And then, I was very disturbed by that comment. Obviously, I thought it was very treating First Nations as second-class citizens. And then I said to him, I said, well, Mr. Premier, did you say that to your last employer? Why should they be rich? I mean, it's not about us being rich. It's about having the opportunity for us to be able to take care of ourselves, and grow our economies in our First Nation communities. That's what we're looking for. And it's very unfortunate when you can't work with a government that won't do that. And I'm saddened by that because I believe together we can be so much stronger. And we have that opportunity. But divided, and that's what we're getting right now, is a division within this province. But it's like I always say, Dave, First Nations have been here for hundreds of years. We've seen governments come and go, and we'll survive, and we're gonna persevere. That's the reality, and that's the way we're going. And there's so many issues that you can address within the province of New Brunswick together.
Now, you referenced your peacekeeping group over there, unit. Do they receive training for dealing with mental health calls and de-escalation and this sort of thing? Can you talk about that?
They do. They do through we did it through the New Brunswick Community College. They actually get 25 hours of recognized policing. So in other words, the de-escalation, dealing with mental health, that was part of their de-escalation program and training. So it really helps. It does. When they respond with the RCMP, obviously, if there's weapons involved, it's very difficult for our peacekeepers to become, involved because the RCMP are responding to a weapons situation. But having them close and present and maybe having them be the first contact, just whether it's through be a bullhorn or whatever, and saying, hey, John, hey, Jim, this is, so-and-so, because they know everybody in the community, we can de-escalate. And that's I believe that's a work in progress that we have to work together on with the RCMP, with us, with the federal government, and as well as the provincial government.
Now, I think that the shooting raises questions about what actions authorities have taken to rein in the deadly use of force, especially since June 2020 when those previous shootings occurred. The coroner's inquest in Rodney Levi's case recommended that in situations involving mental wellness checks on First Nations, RCMP should not be the first responder, it said. It continued, but be on standby for mobile crisis units or for an Aboriginal liaison for the community. That's a quote from the coroner's inquest. Manju Varma, the commissioner on systemic racism, said in her 2022 report that those recommendations from the coroner's inquest should be implemented, she said, without delay. So just your comment on this, and are we any closer to achieving this goal in First Nations more generally in New Brunswick?
It was great to see that report from Ms. Varga, and I'll tell you now, the original report we got was not the report that the government released. They got the government. They released the watered down version. She was very critical of the provincial government, very not satisfied with the actions being taken by the provincial government. And, she had said, systematic racism is alive and well. And she had made some recommendations to the provincial government, and none of it, again, no relationship with with First Nations, no relationship with the government. How can we move on anything? I believe that report is probably filed and on a shelf somewhere, is no doubt.
She actually called for a public inquiry into systemic racism in the original midterm draft, if I recall correctly.
She did, Dave. You're exactly right.
Later removed, is that right? Yeah.
And I think there was an opportunity to take some action there. I mean, it didn't have to be a full inquiry, but I mean, that's what we were calling for. Obviously, from a First Nation, we would like to see that, but there's no action whatsoever. And now here we are with, another individual in one of our First Nations communities, being shot by a police force. I mean, it's got to the point where we don't even know, as leaders in our community, should we be calling the RCMP in these situations? Or should we be addressing it ourselves? I mean, it puts you into question. And because we don't want any more of our members to be deceased in our communities because of a police call. But I still believe that relationship building is what we've got to do and we've got to work on. And we're very fortunate here in Pabineau, we've been able to do that. And, perhaps it's a different mentality with the officers who are here, but I believe it's a model that could be copied and put across every community and say, okay, this is what we should be doing. This is how we work together, and I believe there's a solution.
A moment ago, you mentioned understaffing in the RCMP and this kind of thing. Of course, in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 shootings and, not just in New Brunswick, but also south of the border, there were calls for defunding the police or reallocating resources away from police and towards other mental health services, for example. I take it that you reject those calls from your comments.
I think we need, listen, we've got to address each issue. And I always say this to government, what they do is they Band-Aid it. Okay, we'll make this. Okay, now it's fixed. Okay, we'll put a little Band-Aid on it. It's not bleeding anymore. We've got to take the time to address each issue as it arises. Policing, education, our healthcare system. I mean, we've got to take the time, make it right, and then move on to the next one. Make it right. Don't make it an election issue. Do what's right. And I believe that that's a problem with politicians nowadays. They're always looking at, how can I get reelected? What should I do to get reelected? That's not my approach, or any of our leaders here in our community of Pabineau. I don't worry about getting reelected. I do what's right for the community, and let's make it fixed, and let's move on to the next issue. And I think that's what government's got to do. Okay, we know that policing's a problem. Let's fix it. What do we need to fix it? Let's look at it. Fix it, now move on. The education system, we have a lack of teachers coming up. Let's fix it, moving on. Healthcare system, oh my God, the healthcare system. We've underpaid our workers within the healthcare system. Let's fix it and moving on. So I think there's a process, and a lot can be learned from First Nations. I mean, I'll give you an example of us, what we do with our elders. We keep them in their homes. Therefore, there's not, people say, oh my God, that's expensive. Not really. When you consider that if you put them in an old age home, there's a lot more costs associated with that. And within their home, they, at some point, true, they may not be able to care for themselves, but keep them in their home as long as you can, so that you're able to provide the services, whether it be shoveling their driveway, mowing their lawn, providing a transportation for them. At least it's less expensive than putting them someplace else. So these are solutions that you can come up with, but I don't understand why government doesn't look at this sometimes.
Returning to the peacekeepers and so on, there's a recently formed group in Elsipogtog, called Indige-Watch, with members of mental health related training. It sounds very similar to the peacekeeping group that you have in Pabineau. After the death of Iggy Dedam, Indige-Watch put out a statement jointly with Gopit Lodge there, saying they had previously told the RCMP that they wanted to be present for any calls like this when people are in mental distress. And as you say, you alluded to just a moment ago that there were early reports that this was a wellness check, and then later the head of J Division, the RCMP in New Brunswick, stated that was not the case, that it was not a wellness check. A lot of confusion about that. The distinction wasn't made clear by the RCMP. But uh, regardless, we have the situation where you have cases where people are in mental distress, and police are called, and it seems like again and again, this ends in violence and even death. Um, so, just your comment on this kind of collaboration. I mean, how can this be implemented such that police will turn to someone who can de-escalate the situation rather than it ending in gunshots?
I believe Chief Sock and his council are doing a great job in Elsipogtog in trying to keep the community safe and grow their community. They have a lot of challenges there, and they're doing a great job. And from our perspective, that's what we're doing. We're working together with the RCMP, but maybe there's a way to do it that, the RCMP, I have a meeting coming up actually very shortly, and that's one of the issues we're going to raise is when and where should our peacekeepers become involved? At what point should, we say, okay, let's handle it this way. You get a call, it's only a simple phone call to say, hey, we need a peacekeeper here. And boom, they go with them. So they report to that residence. Obviously, if there's weapons, everybody stays back anyway, right? First. And then we slowly, try to reach out to the individual. I think sometimes we're too quick on how we're going to move forward with it. And it's let's get this particular call over and let's move on to the next call. I think you have to be careful on how you do these particular wellness checks or people in mental illness. We've got to address some of these things, not only in our First Nation communities, right across the province. Mental illness is a huge problem. So we've got to get those services to our people out there, our First Nations people, but to the people of New Brunswick as well. They need to get those services because if you're not well in body and well in mind, you're not able to participate. So it's important that we have people who are well in both ways.
Um, Now, these shootings obviously have a profound effect on the local community. I believe Iggy was a father of seven. Big family. And you know, this is just one of several deaths that have occurred in the community there lately. I think that Elsipogtog is really hurting right now, from what I've heard. But additionally, I think it seems like this kind of tragedy also damages the relationship between First Nations and police. So many people wrote on Facebook, if I ever need a wellness check, never send for the RCMP hashtag Justice for Iggy. Again, as we talked about briefly, the police kind of walked back earlier, indications that this was a wellness check. Um, but regardless, there's you know, regardless of whether it was a wellness check or some other type of call, it seems like this represents a low point in relations between the police, the RCMP, which one could say sort of embodies the crown in a sense, and First Nations. What can you say about the relationship?
Wow. I realize there's challenges on both sides, and I think we're fortunate in my community that our relationship is good because we have an open dialogue. We discuss, we come to conclusions. We know who's who in the zoo. We work with the RCMP. Everybody wants a safe community, but at the same time, you want to make sure your residents are safe as well. And I think that open dialogue makes so much of a difference to communicate and say, okay, here we are. But like you stated earlier, one of the big problems now is the damage is there from past. And how do you recreate that trust? Right? That's the reality of it, because that trust, once you lose trust, it's really hard to regain. And I think that's the challenge right now with the RCMP and our First Nation communities. But again, I talk for my community only. I'm very fortunate that our relationship is strong and we continue to grow it. We talk, we have open dialogue. We don't only meet when it's bad things. We discuss stuff. They come again, like I stated earlier, and serve breakfast to the community. They come to our events. They're seen in the community. They know who they are. They know who the individuals are in the community who have some mental health issues. They know the members who have addiction issues. And that's the advantage of, believe, of a small community. In a larger community, it's probably a little more challenging, but it can be done if it's done right.
Okay, now let's talk about the issue of fracking, which, by the way, may raise memories of police interventions during the anti shale gas movement 10 years ago in New Brunswick when it came to its peak. this is of course also called hydraulic fracturing, removing, as you know, natural gas from the ground by injecting this sort of slurry of liquids into the ground. Very controversial. The leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, Blaine Higgs, has repeatedly made the case for more fracking in New Brunswick. Of course, there's resistance led by First Nations in New Brunswick. But to that, Higgs has proposed revenue sharing agreements that he said would be worth upwards of $1 billion over 20 years. At a time when his government has also canceled the tax sharing agreements, as we discussed earlier. So you're on record opposing new fracking development. Is that still your position? And could you comment on it?
Unless the technology's changed. I mean, from my understanding, there is a new technology out there where you can actually, instead of the slurry going into the ground, there's an air type of where just air is going in, and it's the hydraulic fracking is occurring with the air. Now, if there's a way and there's a change, by all means, let's look at it. I'm not opposed to development, but let's be realistic. These numbers that Mr. Higgs is putting out there are just numbers. I can give you any numbers you want as well. He can say $1 billion, but I want to see the paperwork. In reality, this is the reality. There was articles written. I do follow a lot of what's going on in the energy sector, and there's articles written that Europe doesn't want any more natural gas. They look at it as a transition over the next 5 to 7 years. So if you're going to put this big infrastructure, and because it is a huge investment as well, into the region for natural gas or fracking, really, is the market going to be there? Nobody can say that, because we're changing. It's looking at where hydrogen's going. You have small modular nuclear reactors. You have more renewables. I mean, I think it's really a short-sighted view to say fracking is going to. Now, natural gas, if you already had it developed, yes, there's a transition there, but it could take up to 4 or 5 years to develop it before you're actually exporting it to the export market of Europe. And they don't, they've come online. The European, I'd have to take a look again which person actually said it, but it was one of the leaders within Europe who said, look, if you're looking at natural gas, it's a short term, it's not a long term. So yeah, I mean, again, if the technologies change, we could look at it, but is it really the solution? I don't think so.
As it stands, it seems too dangerous. A group called the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment has called recently for a permanent ban on fracking, saying it presents, quote, unacceptable health risks in nearby communities, including birth defects, and that there's increasing evidence in this regard. We'll have more on that on nbmediacoop.org.
Yeah, see, that's a great point, David. And like I said, I haven't seen that, so I don't. But that's, again, apparently the new technology, which would not have slurry going into the ground, but a high velocity air. Then you'd have to look at it. Then I'd be open to it. But as you said, you're putting chemicals into the ground. The chemicals aren't coming up. Where are they going? It's a simple process. And again, I've approached Mr. Higgs. There's other opportunities out there, but why are you so hellbound on fracking? Let's look at the other opportunities. Let's see what we can do. And that's why at the Port of Baldoon, we're working with many companies to look at other alternatives and opportunities that we could do. Hydrogen being one. I realize the technology is a longer ways out, but it's still coming. Let's start pushing those. And I think that's going to be the long-term solution.
The NB Media Club has reached out to New Brunswick's political parties, major political parties, for their take on this. We know that the Greens have a long-standing demand for a permanent moratorium on fracking. The Liberal Party recently adopted a resolution at a convention calling for a permanent moratorium. We're waiting to hear back from them to see if they plan to implement that if they form government. They previously put in place a temporary moratorium under Brian Gallant, saying that a number of conditions would have to be met for it to be lifted, including a social license and appropriate consultations with First Nations. Just your reading in the community, what is the, I guess, level of social license among your community?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Dave. Look, it's in the community. No, as it stands right now, there's no support for fracking, and the reason being, we have wells here. We're on well water. That's our source of water here in the community, and people are scared about that. And in municipalities around the region, rural municipalities, that's their concern as well. And I stand with them on that. Until you can prove that technology is safer, and that you're not putting chemicals in the ground, then, you know, maybe I'd have a different approach. But, you know, there's so many things out there. Glyphosate is another example. I mean, you know, we're talking about the glyphosate issue, and people are asking, well, is it safe? Is it not safe? I mean, no long-term studies have been done. What are the long-term exposures to glyphosate? What happens to the body in small amounts, minute amounts, but what happens to the body? Nobody knows. And, you know, yet, you know, it's been banned in Quebec. So these are things, you know, the government seems to not want to address them for some reason. And it's frustrating from a First Nation perspective because, listen, we look at things from a 7-generation perspective, the next 7 generations. And for us, we want to make sure that everything is here for the next 7 generations. And that's the way we operate here in Pabineau. And it's very unfortunate to see these things happen and they get pushed through and there's not enough thought put into it.
Before we wrap up, Chief, let's go to the question of land title. Blaine Higgs commented on this during the CBC leaders debate. I want to go to a clip of that.
Firstly, to distinguish, the legally binding treaties would be the reserve land that was once promised to the First Nations communities, and speaking of New Brunswick, and which has been eroded over the years. And we absolutely support the return of that. In fact, we're intervening in one case to support Elsipogtog in their claim that their reserve land had been depleted over the years. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about something that was not unceded territory, and it was not ceded territory, excuse me. And the idea is that we do not have that as a treaty right, and our entire province is being claimed as for ownership by the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseets. This is unique in Canada. This is very unique. And the situation here is they want the property value, they want taxes to come to them as such rather than the provincial government, taxes that we use for everyone. So there's a big distinction between reserve land that was taken away and then a lawsuit that's affecting the entire province. So if you want someone that is actually going to get to the bottom of this and ensure that people in this province, private citizens, are respected and we find a way path forward, we're doing that.
Thank you.
So there you go. Blaine Higgs's comments during the leaders' debates on land title. Your response, Chief Richardson.
Look, Mr. Blaine Higgs needs an education in Treaties 101. We've signed a peace and friendship treaty in the province of New Brunswick. We've never unceded, and he's saying it's unique in Canada. I suggest he look at British Columbia. Same situation as New Brunswick. And I'll give you a case out in BC where they've given the land back to the First Nations. Nobody's been misplaced. No communities are being overrun. No tax issue or tax base is being destroyed. Mr. Higgs is protecting one particular company individually, and that's no doubt about it. And that's the unfortunate part. You know, the reality is this: we're not taking. Oh, sorry.
You're referring to the Irving companies.
I prefer to call them the company that shall not be named. But yeah, I mean, in reality, it's this. You know, we know where we work for. I mean, only in New Brunswick where you have a person who gets a pension from a company and makes decisions for that company from the province side, and it's not considered a conflict of interest. Very unfortunate for that. But anyway, getting back to the land claim, we're not bringing the individuals. We're bringing this government. We want to negotiate. When the government refuses to negotiate, you have, as I stated earlier, negotiation, litigation. We want to negotiate. This government doesn't want to negotiate. They don't recognize it. Precedence is set. It's in the Supreme Court. So we go to the Supreme Court. The province fights it. We go to the Supreme Court. Do you know what the Supreme Court is going to say? Go back to the table and negotiate. So then he's going to be put in a situation where, since we haven't negotiated in good faith, it's going to be even worse. All we're asking for is a chance to have a say in what happens in natural resource development in this province on Crown lands. Presently, we have no say. This government makes their decision, and that's it. You know, it was always something that was overlooked for many, many, many years, the fact that we've only signed peace and friendship treaties, and that the land was never ceded. So every government to government, they just kept it going, until finally, First Nations wise, we said, what's happening here? Why are we not benefiting from resources that are being extracted from our First Nation, from our territories? And that's what we've done. The Mi'kmaq claim, we've taken the province to court, not individual homeowners. Nobody's going to be displaced, as Mr. Higgs says. And you know what? There's still going to be a tax base. The only thing is we want to say in what happens. And as well, what about the resources that have been taken, Mr. Higgs? You axe our tax agreement, But now you're saying, you're not giving us anything in return. We want to sit with a government that's willing to negotiate, Dave. And that's the problem we have, is this particular government doesn't want to negotiate, which is unfortunate, because at the table, we could accomplish so much more. Negotiate it, and we're not in litigation. I was very disappointed last night that nobody asked the question to Mr. Higgs, how much has legal fees cost this province presently? I mean, all litigation against unions, against First Nations, everything that they've litigated. How much is it costing this province? Because I think the only people getting rich are the big law firms in Fredericton. I guarantee you that. And that's unfortunate, because there's been millions and millions of dollars. I would be surprised if it's not $100 million been spent on legal fees by this provincial government. Whereas if we all sat at the table and we negotiated, don't get me wrong, there could be a point where litigation has to happen, but negotiate first, and that'll prevent litigation. So the land claim, we're suing the government. We brought the government of New Brunswick to court, and the Wolastoqey have brought the government of New Brunswick plus the lessees to court, which is slight because they're within their territory. And then Mr. Higgs talks about Elsipogtog. We're in the process of looking at, instead of the Elsipogtog having a separate land claim, it'll be a Mi'kmaq land claim. And we're in those talks right now. And we're also in the talks of how our territories overlap. And there is a territory where Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq people, share that territory. So we're saying, let's do that. And we're doing that. We're negotiating more than the government's willing to negotiate with us. That's the scary part.
It's interesting that he referenced the Elsipogtog claim relative to the reserve itself. I believe this is a what's called a specific claim that been put forward by Elsipogtog a number of years ago, 2016 if I'm not mistaken, possibly 2017, about the reserve being basically encroached upon over a number of years, or parts of it being more or less sold off. But this is quite separate from the land title question, I believe.
You're 100% right. One is a specific land claim. The other one is what we call comprehensive land claim. There's a difference between the two, right? So the specific land claim that Elsipogtog has done, we have specific land claims in our territory as well. I think every community does, basically. But the overall comprehensive land claim is what we're saying. Listen, let's sit down, let's talk, let's negotiate, and let's come up with an understanding. Dave, I say working with government is so important, and working together. I look at the ministers who have had the opportunity, who are no longer, I might add, members of this party, but we worked with them. Minister Holland, a great guy. Mike Holland, awesome guy, no longer with government. Minister Arlene Dunn, her heart was there, she just left. Alain, from Moncton, great guy, just left. All these MLAs are leaving for a reason. It's because they can't work with a dictator, a person who has a my way or highway approach.
Well, I think some of them might have left cabinet, but not the party itself.
No, they've left cabinet. Yeah. But they could have been reelected, or could have ran again, but they just know that the frustration, I believe, they know the frustration of working with, this particular individual is just, it's not worth it. I mean, we have to remember where Mr. Higgs came from. He came from the Core Party. I mean, he started the Core Party way back in 89, I believe. He was trying to get it go. He's trying to become the leader of the Core Party. And we know what he stood for.
Anglophone rights party.
Anglophone rights, known First Nation rights, unification, one people, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's not what Canada's about. Canada's about diversification, and I always say, a leopard doesn't change its spots. And, the reality here is, if we could still, if there was anybody else, this is how bad it is, David. If there was some other leader leading the Conservative Party, I would have a hard time to determine who I would vote for. I'll be honest. I'm not a liberal. I'm not a conservative. I want a green. I want a party I can work with. I want people who are going to be there for the benefit of everybody in the province, not just select groups. And that's the reality of where we are.
Definitely not an endorsement of the status quo of the current government. Are you endorsing any political party or candidate?
I am endorsing anybody but Mr. Higgs right now. Mr. Coons is a good candidate. Ms. Holt is a good candidate. I'll give you another example of disrespect. We reached out to the leaders to come and meet Mi'kmaq chiefs of New Brunswick. Okay. Mr. Coons met with us. Miss Holt met with us. Mr. Higgs has not met with us. It's an example of disrespect. I mean, you know, and ironically, no promises were made. None. But a promise of working together, negotiating out our differences. And at the end of the day, if we agree to disagree, we'll agree to disagree. But let's try to move together. Let's move the province together. Let's unite this province, and let's get to some place where New Brunswick can be a leader. And I believe we're headed down the right direction if we work together.
Well, maybe a good note to end it on. Chief Terry Richardson of Papineau First Nation, thanks so much for speaking to the NB Media Co-op today.
And I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.